The first fingers of dawn slipped through the cracks of the slave quarters as Esther stirred, her body still heavy from the previous day's labor. At 42, she had spent close to 30 years within the walls of the Thornhill mansion, her hands crafting elaborate meals that had made Master William Thornhill one of Charleston's most renowned hosts. Her prowess as a cook was well known throughout the city's highest circles, though those who relished her creations seldom gave a thought to the woman who made them. Esther rose quietly, taking care not to rouse Ida, the young house slave who shared her small space. The girl had been crying again in her sleep, likely from the fresh welt's master Thornhill had left across her back yesterday for dropping a crystal goblet. Esther's expression grew firm as she recalled the girl's muffled cries. They echoed too closely to memories she had tried to bury deep within herself. The Thornhill mansion on East Bay Street was a symbol of prosperity built on the labor of people like Esther. Its white columns and sprawling verandas overlooked Charleston Harbor, where ships delivered exotic spices that flowed through Esther's skilled fingers before reaching the tables of South Carolina's finest. The kitchen was her territory, the sole space where she held any illusion of authority, though even there Mistress Caroline's endless criticism and Master Thornhill's sudden appearances hovered like specters. As Christmas of 1847 drew near, the mansion buzzed with energy for the annual Thornhill Christmas Ball. This year promised to be especially extravagant, with Governor Johnson himself expected to attend. Esther moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, directing the two young assistants while laying out the grand meal that would highlight her skills that had spared her from being sold when Master Thornhill's gambling debts had forced him to trim his household 3 years prior. "Esther, where is my breakfast?" Mistress Caroline's sharp voice cut through the morning's activity. The woman appeared at the kitchen doorway, already dressed in her morning gown, her face pinched with habitual displeasure. "Coming directly, mistress," Esther responded, her tone carefully neutral, to hide any trace of resentment. She placed the finishing touches on the tray. Eggs prepared exactly as the mistress preferred, with thin slices of ham and fresh biscuits. "It's nearly 8. William has business in town and can't be delayed. And for heaven's sake, make certain the coffee is hot this time." Caroline sniffed, casting a critical glance around the kitchen before turning away. Esther's hands quivered slightly as she poured the coffee, remembering the previous week when Master Thornhill had thrown the lukewarm cup at her, the porcelain splintering against the wall, while the hot liquid burned her arm. She still wore the bandage beneath her sleeve. Later that morning, as Esther ground herbs for the day's cooking, Master Thornhill entered the kitchen without warning. His imposing frame filled the doorway, his face flushed from drink despite the early hour. "Esther," he drawled, stepping too close. "Caroline tells me you've been sluggish this morning." His breath reeked of whiskey as he leaned toward her. "Perhaps you're getting too old for your role. I saw a fine young cook at the auction yesterday." The pestle in Esther's hand stilled. "No, master. I'm well and working as always." His hand reached out, fingers tracing the edge of her headscarf. "You'd better be. The Christmas ball must be flawless. Governor Johnson has shown particular interest in your famous oyster stew." His fingers slid down to her cheek in a gesture that made her stomach churn. "It would be a shame to replace you before then." When he finally left, Esther realized she had been holding her breath. She resumed grinding the herbs with renewed intensity, each stroke of the pestle against the mortar like a pulse of suppressed anger. 28 years in this house, 28 years of cooking feasts she could not taste, of watching her children sold off, of enduring Thornhill's wandering hands and cruel temper. That evening, as Esther prepared a simple stew for the slave's meal, old Jeremiah, the stable hand, who had been at the Thornhill plantation longer than anyone, hobbled into the kitchen. At nearly 70, he was one of the few remaining links to Esther's past. He had known her mother before consumption had taken her. "Miss Esther," he whispered, his voice raspy with age. "They taking Lucy to the auction tomorrow." Esther's hand froze over the pot. Lucy was Ida's 13-year-old sister, a delicate girl who had been training as a house servant. "Why?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Jeremiah's eyes darted toward the door. Master's debts again. Heard him and Mrs. arguing. He lost bigot cards last night. A familiar numbness spread through Esther's chest. She had witnessed this scene too many times. Thornhill's debts settled with human currency. Her own children, first James, when he was just 7, then Sarah at 10, had been sold to cover Master Thornhill's excesses. She had not been permitted to say goodbye to either. That night Esther lay awake, listening to Ida's quiet weeping. The girl had learned about her sister's fate. Morning would bring another heartbreak, another severed bond. Outside, the winter wind whistled through the bare branches of the oak trees lining the drive. Trees from which a runaway had been hanged last spring as a warning to the others. As moonlight filtered through the small window, illuminating Ida's tear-stained face, something within Esther hardened. The Christmas ball was 3 weeks away. Governor Johnson, Judge Preston, the Whitmans, the Sinclairs, all of Charleston's elite would gather to feast on her creations, while children were torn from their mothers and girls like Ida trembled at their master's approach. Esther closed her eyes, her thoughts turning to the small box, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her pallet. Inside was a packet of white powder given to her years ago by an old root woman who had whispered, "For the day when suffering becomes too much to endure." Esther had kept it through the years, a small token of potential power in a powerless existence. As she drifted toward sleep, a plan began to take shape, intricate as the sugar sculptures she fashioned for Thornhill's tables, bitter as the herbs she crushed each morning. By Christmas night, everything would change. They had taken everything from her, her children, her dignity, her life. The time had come to reclaim something. The morning would bring Lucy's sale and Ida's grief. But beyond that, it would bring the first day of Esther's silent countdown to the Christmas ball, where she would finally serve the Thornhills and their guests her most unforgettable meal yet. The slave auction block stood in the heart of Charleston's commercial district, a wooden platform worn smooth by the countless feet that had stood upon it, awaiting judgment and sale. Esther had not been allowed to accompany Ida to say goodbye to Lucy, but from the kitchen window she had watched the girl return, supported by Jeremiah, her young face transformed by grief into something ancient and hollow. That evening, as Esther prepared dinner for the household, Master Thornhill entered the kitchen in high spirits. The sale had evidently gone well. "A fine price for that girl," he announced to no one in particular, helping himself to a slice of ham from the cutting board. "Gentleman from Virginia. Breeds fine house servants," he said. "She'll do well there." Esther kept her eyes down, her knife rhythmically chopping carrots with practiced precision. Each cut was clean, decisive. In her mind, it was not carrots beneath her blade. "The Christmas ball will need to be even more impressive now," Thornhill continued, oblivious to her thoughts. "I've invited the Prestons and the Havilands as well. 25 guests in total." He popped another piece of ham into his mouth. "Governor Johnson particularly mentioned your peach cobbler from last summer's gathering. See that it's on the menu." "Yes, Master," Esther replied, her voice empty of inflection. That night brought no sleep. Instead, Esther lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories washing over her like dark waves. 28 years ago she had arrived at the Thornhill household, barely 14, separated from her family at a plantation in Virginia. She had been purchased specifically for her cooking skills, already evident despite her youth. Master Thornhill's father had been alive then, a man whose cruelty was cold and calculated rather than volatile like his son's. She remembered her first beating, earned for oversalting a stew. The birth of her son James in the small room she now shared with Ida. The joy of his small hand in hers as she taught him to identify herbs in the kitchen garden. Then the day Master Thornhill had inherited the house after his father's death and decided that 7-year-old James would make a fine gift for his cousin in Georgia. 3 years later, Sarah had been born, the result of a night Esther had tried to scrub from her memory with lye soap that left her hands raw for weeks. Beautiful Sarah, with her quick mind and quicker smile, sold on her 10th birthday to pay a gambling debt, just as Lucy had been sold today. A sound from Ida's pallet broke through Esther's reverie. The girl was whimpering in her sleep, one hand reaching out as if trying to grasp something or someone just beyond reach. 2 days later, the incident that crystallized Esther's resolve occurred. She had been instructing Ida in the proper way to polish silver for the upcoming ball when Mistress Caroline entered the dining room in a state of agitation. Absolutely unacceptable, she declared, waving a letter. The Sinclairs have requested special accommodation for their eldest daughter. Apparently, she's developed a delicate condition of the digestion and requires plain food without rich sauces. She fixed her cold eyes on Esther. You'll need to prepare separate dishes for her. Yes, mistress, Esther replied. And make sure everything else is perfect. William says this ball could secure his position on the Harbor Commission. I won't have your cooking embarrass us. After Caroline left, Esther resumed demonstrating the silver polishing, her movements mechanical, while her mind raced. The request meant extra work, but it also meant a separate dish for at least one guest. A dish that would need to be identifiably different. That afternoon, as Esther descended into the cool darkness of the root cellar to select vegetables, she noticed a strange smell near the back wall. Following it, she discovered a dead rat among the potato barrels. Sickness followed such creatures. Everyone knew that. Holding her breath, she disposed of the corpse, but not before the idea took root in her mind. Illness at a dinner party, food that disagreed with delicate constitutions. Such things happened even in the finest houses. That evening, after the household had settled, Esther slipped from her pallet, careful not to disturb Ida. Silently, she pried up the loose floorboard and removed the small wooden box hidden there. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of faded cloth, was the packet of white powder the root woman had given her years ago. This come from the manchineel tree, the old woman had whispered. White folks call it the death apple. Just a little brings sickness. More than a little brings sleep that don't end. Esther had kept it all these years, never quite daring to use it, never quite able to discard it. Now, by the faint moonlight streaming through the window, she studied the innocuous powder. It looked like flour or fine sugar, substances that passed through her hands daily as she created delicacies for the Thornhill table. A sound from outside froze her in place. Quickly she rewrapped the packet and returned it to its hiding place. Tomorrow would begin 3 weeks of intense preparation for the Christmas ball. 3 weeks to refine her plan, to decide who would merely suffer and who would never rise from the Thornhill table again. The following morning brought a fresh horror that shattered any lingering doubts in Esther's mind. She was kneading dough for the day's bread, when a commotion in the yard drew her to the window. Master Thornhill stood over Jeremiah. The elderly stable hand was doubled over on the ground. Even from a distance, Esther could see blood darkening the old man's shirt. "Thieving old devil." Thornhill's voice carried clearly. "Do you think I don't inventory my liquor?" Esther watched, hands coated in flour, as Thornhill delivered another kick to Jeremiah's ribs. The old man made no sound now, his body simply absorbing the blows. Beside Thornhill stood Mr. Parsons, the overseer, holding a half-empty bottle of the master's prized bourbon. Later, Esther learned the truth from Samuel, the young stable boy. Jeremiah had taken the alcohol not for himself, but as medicine for his rheumatism that had grown unbearable with the winter cold. The punishment had been 10 lashes, followed by Thornhill's drunken beating. That night, Esther slipped away to the small shed where Jeremiah lay on a pallet of straw, his back across, hatch of open wounds. She brought poultices of herbs to draw out infection and a small portion of the kitchen's precious honey to help with healing. "Ah, you shouldn't risk it, Miss Esther," Jeremiah whispered, his voice breaking with pain as she gently applied the poultice. "Hush now," she replied, her movements sure despite the poor light from the single candle she'd brought. "We look after our own." Jeremiah's gnarled hand caught hers. "Is talking of selling me south," he said. "Say I'm too old for keeping now." Esther felt something tear inside her. Jeremiah had been the one constant throughout her years at the Thornhill household. He had held her when she wept for her children, had slipped extra food to her when she was pregnant, had been a grandfather to James and Sarah in a place where family bonds were severed as casually as rotten threads. "When?" she asked, her voice strangled. "After Christmas." Heard him tell Parsons. Jeremiah's eyes, cloudy with cataracts and age, fixed on a point beyond her shoulder. "Don't matter much. Don't think I'll heal right from this beating anyway." 3 days later, Jeremiah's prediction proved accurate. Infection set into his wounds, bringing fever and delirium. Esther begged to be allowed to care for him, but Mistress Caroline refused. "You have preparations for the ball," she said dismissively. "Parsons will see to him." Parsons's idea of seeing to the old man consisted of moving him to an isolated shed at the edge of the property to prevent his moans from disturbing the household. When Esther finally managed to slip away to check on him, she found him burning with fever, his wounds putrid, his breathing labored. She held water to his cracked lips, but he could barely swallow. "My Sarah," he mumbled, mistaking her for someone from his past. "My sweet girl." By morning, Jeremiah was dead. He was buried in the slave cemetery beyond the kitchen garden with no ceremony, his grave marked only by a small stone Esther placed there when no one was watching. That night, kneeling beside her pallet while Ida slept, Esther removed the manchineel powder from its hiding place. In the darkness, she made her final decision. This would not be a random act of vengeance. It would be justice, calculated, measured and precise as her cooking. Master Thornhill, Mistress Caroline, and the overseer Parsons would receive the fullest measure. The others, the guests who dined and laughed while people like Jeremiah suffered, they would taste enough to remember this Christmas ball for whatever remained of their lives. As she concealed the powder again, Esther felt a strange calm descend. Fear and doubt fell away, replaced by a clarity of purpose she had not known since being torn from her family as a girl. For the first time in decades, she felt she was choosing her own path rather than following one forced upon her. 2 weeks remained until Christmas. 2 weeks to perfect her plan, to ensure that no suspicion would fall on her or any other slave in the household. 2 weeks until she would finally balance the scales, that had been weighted against her from birth. With Jeremiah's unmarked grave still fresh in the slave cemetery, Esther moved through the Thornhill mansion like a ghost, present but unseen as she always had been. Yet inside, something had fundamentally changed. Each command she obeyed, each dish she prepared, each "yes, mistress" that passed her lips was now merely a performance. The final act before the curtain would fall on Christmas night. The mansion transformed around her as preparations for the ball intensified. Garlands of pine and holly adorned the banisters and mantels. Candles by the hundred were delivered and arranged in silver candelabras. The crystal and china were inspected piece by Mistress Caroline, who found fault with the slightest water spot or tarnish. "These plates show fingerprints, Esther," she complained one afternoon, holding a Wedgwood plate to the light. "Have Ida wash them again. And mind she doesn't break any. They were my grandmother's." In the kitchen, Esther's authority was absolute. Even Mistress Caroline rarely interfered with the actual cooking. Knowing that Esther's reputation among Charleston's elite was a valuable social currency, this autonomy would be critical to Esther's plan. 10 days before Christmas, Esther began testing. In a small shed behind the kitchen garden, where she sometimes dried herbs, she carefully opened the packet of manchineel powder. Using the tip of a knife, she placed a minuscule amount in a cup of broth, then fed it to one of the stray cats that lingered around the property. The animal became violently ill, but recovered by the next day. She adjusted the dose slightly for a second test. This time, the cat slept for nearly a day, but eventually staggered to its feet, disoriented but alive. The third test, with a measure she judged to be approximately double the second dose, proved fatal within hours. Esther recorded these measurements precisely in her mind, committing them to memory alongside her recipes. The powder had no distinctive smell and only the faintest bitter taste that would be easily masked by strong flavors, especially in holiday dishes heavy with spices, sugar, and spirits. The menu for the Christmas ball had been set weeks ago. Oyster stew to begin, followed by glazed ham, roast duck, and beef tenderloin. Side dishes would include sweet potatoes with bourbon, creamed spinach, and Carolina rice pilaf. Desserts would feature Esther's famous peach cobbler made with preserved summer peaches, mince pies, and a spectacular Christmas pudding flamed with brandy. For Miss Sinclair, with her delicate digestion, Esther would prepare a separate plate with plain roast chicken and unseasoned vegetables. This would be her first vehicle for vengeance, containing enough of the powder to ensure violent illness, but not death. The girl's suffering would disrupt the ball and serve as a distraction for what would follow. 7 days before Christmas, a delivery arrived from the apothecary. Seasonings and flavorings that Mistress Caroline had specially ordered for the ball. Among them was oil of bitter almonds, used sparingly to flavor the marzipan decorations that would adorn the Christmas cake. Esther noted how similar its fragrance was to the manchineel powder, providing another layer of misdirection should anyone later question the faint, bitter scent. The elaborate planning helped distract Esther from the hollow-eyed grief of Ida, who moved through her tasks like a sleepwalker since Lucy's sale. The girl had become dangerously thin, refusing most food and speaking only when directly addressed. Esther tried to protect her as much as possible, assigning her tasks in the kitchen where she could keep watch rather than letting her fall under Parsons's scrutiny. 5 days before Christmas, another element fell into place. Master Thornhill announced that Governor Johnson had requested Esther's special rum punch, a concoction famous among Charleston's elite for its potent blend of Caribbean rum, fruit juices, and secret spices. The punch would be served in a silver bowl, with Thornhill himself ladling it into crystal cups for his honored guests. "Make it strong, Esther," he instructed with a wink. "The governor enjoys his spirits, and I need him in a generous mood." The punch would be perfect, strong enough to mask any bitter undertaste, served late enough in the evening that its effects would manifest after most of the meal had been consumed, into the master's cup and those of his closest associates. Parsons, Judge Preston, who had sentenced 3 runaway slaves to hanging last spring, and Dr. Whitman, known for his theories on the biological inferiority of Negroes, would go the fatal dose. 3 days before Christmas, Esther made her final preparations. She had accumulated small amounts of the powder in a peppermint tin, which she kept hidden in a hollow space beneath a loose brick in the kitchen fireplace. The day's heat erased any trace of scent, and the blackened interior of the fireplace made the hiding spot invisible to casual inspection. She also began subtly establishing her alibi, complaining of an ache in her joints. Believable at her age, and in the damp December weather, she made sure several house slaves, and even Mistress Caroline, observed her moving more slowly, occasionally rubbing her wrists or knees. "Don't you dare fall ill before the ball," Caroline warned. "I don't care if you collapse afterward, but you will see this event through perfectly." "Yes, mistress," Esther replied, eyes downcast to hide the cold hatred that flashed through them. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." 2 nights before Christmas, Esther awoke to the sound of Ida weeping in her sleep again. The girl's thin body shook with sobs, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold something or someone that wasn't there. Gently, Esther stroked her brow until the sobbing subsided. In that moment, looking down at Ida's tear-stained face, Esther realized she needed to protect the girl from what was to come. After the Christmas ball, there would be investigations, accusations, perhaps violent reprisals against the household slaves. Ida, in her fragile state, might break under questioning or punishment. The next morning, Esther approached Samuel, the young stable hand who had been close to Jeremiah. "There's a man in the Marsh settlement," she whispered when they were momentarily alone as he delivered firewood to the kitchen. "Old Julius. He helps people sometimes disappear north." Samuel's eyes widened. Such talk was dangerous, punishable by death if overheard by the wrong ears. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, voice barely audible. "After the ball, there might be trouble here," Esther said. "Bad trouble. Ida needs to be gone before then. Can you help?" Samuel hesitated only briefly before nodding. "For Jeremiah," he murmured, "and for Lucy." That night, Esther slipped half of her monthly ration of cornmeal and a precious silver spoon she had stolen from the kitchen into Ida's small bundle of possessions. The spoon could be sold or traded for safe passage once they reached the Marsh settlement. Samuel had agreed to guide Ida away during the chaos of the ball preparations, when the household's attention would be focused entirely on the arriving guests. Christmas Eve arrived crisp and clear, the kind of winter day that Charleston's elite considered perfect for social gatherings. The mansion hummed with activity as final preparations were made. Greenery was refreshed, candles were positioned, and the dining room was transformed into a glittering showcase of Thornhill wealth and prestige. In the kitchen, Esther worked with methodical precision, directing the 2 assistant cooks and several house slaves temporarily assigned to help. The oysters were shucked, the hams glazed, the duck and beef prepared for roasting. The peach cobbler cooled on the windowsill, and the Christmas pudding sat ready for its dramatic flaming. Mistress Caroline made frequent appearances, inspecting every detail with critical eyes. Master Thornhill visited only once, helping himself to a slice of ham and a glass of the rum punch base that Esther was preparing. "Perfect," he declared after tasting the punch. Add more rum to the final mixture. I want everyone in fine spirits tonight. As the winter sun began to set, casting long shadows across the kitchen garden, Esther sent most of the helpers away to prepare themselves for serving duties. Alone in the kitchen at last, she moved swiftly. From beneath the brick in the fireplace, she retrieved the peppermint tin. With hands that did not tremble, she measured the powder precisely into several small paper twists, each marked with a tiny invisible scratch to indicate its strength. These she concealed within her clothing, secured in the secret pocket she had sewn into her apron. The remainder of the powder went back into its hiding place. Insurance should anything go wrong with the initial plan. As she finished, Ida appeared at the kitchen door dressed in her serving clothes, her face still bearing the hollow look that had haunted it since Lucy's sale. "Miss Esther," she said softly, "Samuel says to tell you it's arranged for tonight during the fireworks display." Esther nodded, then moved to embrace the girl, perhaps for the last time. "You listen to Samuel," she whispered. "You run and don't look back. Find your way north, find freedom." Ida pulled back, confusion in her eyes. "Aren't you coming too?" Esther shook her head. "My journey is different," she said, "but I'll find my freedom tonight as well." Before Ida could question further, the back door opened, and the other house slaves began returning to collect the first trays of appetizers. The ball was about to begin. The final act was about to play out. As Esther arranged oysters on silver platters, she felt a strange sense of calm. For 28 years, she had been merely an instrument of the Thornhill's pleasure and status. Her skills exploited, her body violated, her children torn away. Tonight, the Thornhills and their guests would become instruments of her justice. Outside, carriages began to arrive, their wheels crunching on the gravel drive. Ladies in silk and velvet, gentlemen in fine wool, and starched linen would soon fill the mansion, laughing and drinking, never sparing a thought for the hands that prepared their feast or the lives destroyed to build their fortune. Esther straightened her apron and checked that the paper twists were secure in their hidden pocket. The time had come to serve her masterpiece, a meal that Charleston society would never forget. The Thornhill mansion blazed with light as Charleston's elite arrived for the Christmas ball. Carriages lined the circular drive, depositing ladies in rustling silk gowns and gentlemen in formal evening wear. Inside, the grand hallway echoed with laughter and conversation as servants took coats and offered trays of champagne to arriving guests. In the kitchen, Esther moved with the practiced efficiency of decades, directing the final preparations with quiet authority. The oyster stew simmered gently, releasing aromas of cream and sherry. The glazed ham rested before carving, its surface caramelized to a perfect mahogany sheen. Duck and beef roasted in the large ovens, their drippings collected for the rich sauces that would accompany them. Mistress Caroline appeared at regular intervals, her face flushed with nervous excitement. "The governor has arrived," she announced during one such visit. And Judge Preston brought his new wife, much younger than expected, wearing Paris fashion. Her eyes narrowed at Esther. "Is everything proceeding as planned?"
"Yes, mistress,"
Esther replied, her voice betraying nothing of the alternative plan, unfolding beneath the official one. "The first course will be ready to serve in 15 minutes. As Caroline departed, Esther turned to the special plate being prepared for Miss Sinclair. With gloved hands, a precaution she had insisted upon, claiming a minor cut, she sprinkled the first of her powder doses onto the plain chicken breast, then covered it with a light herb sauce that would mask any bitterness. The amount was precisely measured to cause severe, but not fatal distress. The oyster stew went out first, carried by servants, including Ida, whose eyes now held a strange mixture of sorrow and anticipation. Esther had told her nothing of the poisoning plan, wanting her untainted by knowledge that could endanger her escape. Through the kitchen doorway, Esther caught glimpses of the dining room. 5 of Charleston's most powerful citizens, seated around the gleaming mahogany table, crystal and silver reflecting the light of dozens of candles. Special plate for Miss Sinclair, Esther instructed one of the serving boys, handing him the doctored dish when the main course was ready to go out. She watched as it was delivered to a pale young woman seated near the center of the table beside an older couple, presumably the Sinclairs. The regular dinner service proceeded smoothly, platters of meat and side dishes arranged on the sideboard for the footman to serve. Esther remained in the kitchen, ostensibly supervising, but in reality waiting for her moment. That moment would come with the rum punch and dessert course, which tradition dictated she would help serve personally. And honor Master Thornhill insisted upon to showcase his prized cook to his important guests. Approximately 30 minutes into the main course, the first sign that her plan was working came in the form of a commotion from the dining room. A woman's voice cried out in alarm, followed by the scraping of chairs and concerned questions. One of the serving boys rushed into the kitchen. "Miss Sinclair's taken ill," he reported. "Terrible sick all of a sudden. Master says bring cool cloths and water." Esther feigned appropriate concern, dispatching Ida with the requested items while she continued preparations for dessert. Through the serving door, she could hear the continued disruption. Miss Sinclair had apparently been removed from the table, her mother accompanying her to one of the upstairs guest rooms. Dr. Whitman, present as a guest rather than in his professional capacity, had gone to attend to her. The timing was perfect. The distraction would allow Esther to implement the next phase of her plan with less scrutiny. She removed the Christmas pudding from its basin and placed it on a silver platter surrounded by sprigs of holly. Then, with steady hands, she prepared the rum punch, adding the final measure of Caribbean rum to the mixture of fruit juices and spices. From within her apron pocket, she withdrew the prepared paper twists. When no one was looking, she emptied their contents into the punch bowl, stirring thoroughly to ensure the powder dissolved completely. Then she set aside the special cups for Master Thornhill, Overseer Parsons, Judge Preston, and Dr. Whitman, who would return once Miss Sinclair was stabilized. These cups received an additional dusting of powder around their rims, ensuring that these men, the architects and enforcers of so much suffering, would receive a fatal dose. "It's time for the pudding and punch," announced Mistress Caroline, returning to the kitchen. Her face was tense with the strain of maintaining social composure despite the disruption. "We must carry on. The governor is still waiting to taste Esther's famous recipes." "Yes, mistress," Esther replied, her heart beating steadily despite the enormity of what she was about to do. "Everything is ready." The Christmas pudding, doused with warmed brandy and set dramatically aflame, created the intended distraction as Esther entered the dining room for the first time that evening. Guests exclaimed and applauded at the spectacle, temporarily forgetting the unfortunate incident with Miss Sinclair. Behind the pudding came Master Thornhill, carrying the silver punch bowl with exaggerated ceremony. "My friends," he announced to the assembled guests, "while we are all concerned for young Miss Sinclair, Dr. Whitman assures me she will recover with rest. Let us continue our celebration with Esther's legendary rum punch, which Governor Johnson has been anticipating all evening." Esther stood near the sideboard, slicing the pudding and placing portions onto dessert plates that Ida and the other servants distributed. From this position, she could observe as Thornhill ladled the punch into crystal cups, making a show of serving Governor Johnson first, followed by the specially prepared cups for his favorite associates. To a prosperous new year. Thornhill proposed, raising his cup. The guests followed suit, then drank deeply of the potent mixture. Esther watched, her face an impassive mask that revealed nothing of the satisfaction she felt, as her oppressors unwittingly consumed their own destruction. The punch was strong and sweet, the Caribbean rum masking any bitter undertaste from the manchineel powder. Several guests requested second cups, which Thornhill happily provided. As the dessert service continued, Esther moved about the room, accepting compliments on her cooking with the same humble demeanor she had perfected over decades. Inside, she was counting minutes, knowing that the powder's effects would begin manifesting soon. The first sign came as she was serving a portion of peach cobbler to Mrs. Haviland. Across the room, Overseer Parsons grabbed suddenly at his collar, his face flushing a deep red.
William,
He gasped to Master Thornhill. The room is unbearably hot, is it not? Before Thornhill could answer, Parsons swayed in his seat, then slumped forward, his face landing in his dessert plate. For a moment the tableau froze, guests uncertain whether this was merely the result of excessive drink, a common enough occurrence at Charleston social gatherings. Then Judge Preston clutched at his throat, his eyes widening in alarm. "I cannot," he gasped before a violent convulsion shook his substantial frame. His wife screamed as he collapsed beside her, pulling the tablecloth and sending crystal glasses shattering to the floor. Chaos erupted in the dining room. Dr. Whitman, who had just returned from attending to Miss Sinclair, rushed to Judge Preston's side, only to stagger himself, pressing a hand to his chest as beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. "What is happening?" Mistress Caroline shrieked, her carefully cultivated composure shattering as Master Thornhill himself began to cough violently, his face contorting in pain. "Poison!" Someone shouted, and the room exploded into panic. Ladies fainted, gentlemen called for their carriages, and the governor's security details swarmed around him. Though he appeared unaffected, having consumed less of the punch than the others. Amid the pandemonium, Esther moved with deliberate calm. She helped escort frightened guests from the dining room, her face a mask of appropriate concern and confusion. No one noticed when she slipped away to the kitchen, as the first sounds of retching and moaning filled the mansion. In the kitchen, she found Ida waiting, her small bundle of possessions clutched to her chest. Samuel stood beside her, his eyes wide with fear at the commotion coming from the main house. "It's time," Esther told them quietly. "Go now, while everyone is distracted." Ida stepped forward, her thin arms encircling Esther's waist. "Come with us," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. Esther stroked the girl's cheek one last time. "My path lies elsewhere. Now go, find your freedom." After a moment's hesitation, Samuel took Ida's hand and led her toward the back door. Before they slipped out into the darkness, Esther pressed something into Samuel's palm. The last of her hidden treasures, a small gold locket that had once belonged to her mother. "For safe passage," she whispered. "Now run, and don't look back." As they disappeared into the night, Esther turned back toward the dining room. From the doorway, she surveyed the scene of her vengeance. Master Thornhill lay writhing on the floor, foam flecking his lips, his fine waistcoat soiled with vomit. Nearby, Overseer Parsons had stopped moving altogether, his face frozen in a rictus of agony. Judge Preston convulsed violently, his wife kneeling beside him, helplessly calling his name. Dr. Whitman had managed to stagger to a chair, where he sat gasping for breath, his medical knowledge useless against the poison coursing through his veins. Around them, Other guests who had consumed smaller amounts of the tainted punch suffered varying degrees of distress. Vomiting, cramping, some losing consciousness. Mistress Caroline spotted Esther in the doorway and lurched toward her, face contorted with rage and fear. "Help them," she commanded, grabbing Esther's arm with bruising force.
Do something.
Esther looked into the eyes of the woman who had overseen her suffering for nearly 3 decades, who had watched unmoved as Esther's children were sold away, who had turned a blind eye to her husband's unwanted advances. "There is nothing to be done, mistress," Esther replied, her voice calm and clear for perhaps the first time in her life. She did not whisper or avert her eyes as she added, "Their fate was sealed when they first took away what was mine." Understanding dawned slowly on Caroline's face, her eyes widening with horror. "You," she whispered, "you did this." Before she could say more, a particularly violent convulsion seized Master Thornhill. He called out for his wife, his voice barely recognizable. Caroline hesitated, torn between confronting Esther and going to her husband. After a moment, she rushed to Thornhill's side, leaving Esther standing alone in the doorway. Esther surveyed the scene one final time. The elegant dining room had transformed into a vision of turmoil. Fine clothing soiled, dignified facades crumbled, power and privilege rendered meaningless by the great equalizer she had administered. The manchineal had worked precisely as the old root woman had promised all those years ago. She felt no triumph, no joy, only a cold satisfaction that justice so long denied had finally been served. The scales had been balanced for her children, for Jeremiah, for Lucy, for all those who had suffered and died under Thornhill's ownership. There was at last a reckoning. From outside came the sound of running feet and shouted orders. Someone had summoned the authorities. Esther knew her time was short. She could attempt to flee, as Ida and Samuel had done, to seek the northern freedom they pursued. But at 42, with no allies beyond the plantation and the weight of her deed upon her, capture would be inevitable. Instead, she walked with unhurried steps to the kitchen, where the fire still burned in the hearth. From its hiding place, she retrieved the remaining manchineel powder and stirred it into a cup of the same rum punch that had delivered her vengeance. The bitter justice she had served to others would now be her own. As the sounds of men entering the mansion reached her ears, Esther raised the cup to her lips. Her last thoughts were of her children, James and Sarah, their faces already fading in her memory after so many years of separation. She wondered if, in whatever came after this life, she might see them again. The poison worked swiftly. By the time the authorities burst into the kitchen, Esther was beyond their reach. Her body slumped beside the hearth, where she had created countless meals for the family that had owned her in life, but could claim her no longer in death. In the chaos of that Christmas night, few noticed the absence of a young house, slave named Ida, or a stable boy called Samuel. By the time their disappearance was discovered, they were well on their way north, guided by the light of the same stars that had led so many others on the path to freedom. Behind them, the Thornhill mansion stood as a monument to shattered privilege, its Christmas candles burning low as the bodies of its master and his associates grew cold on the dining room floor, victims of a vengeance long simmered and precisely served by hands they had never truly seen. Dawn broke cold and clear over Charleston on December 26, 1847. The Thornhill mansion, which had blazed with light and resounded with festivity just hours before, now stood silent and dark, save for the occasional movement of officials and physicians behind curtained windows. Outside the wrought iron gates, a crowd had gathered, curious onlookers, household slaves from neighboring properties, and reporters from the Charleston Mercury seeking details of the tragedy that had befallen one of the city's prominent families. The facts, as they emerged throughout that day, were these: William Thornhill, prominent businessman and aspiring politician, was dead. So too were Overseer Parsons, Judge Preston, and Dr. Whitman. 7 other guests remained critically ill, including Mistress Caroline, who had collapsed shortly after her husband's final breath. The cause appeared to be poison administered through the rum punch served at the height of the Christmas ball. And the suspected poisoner, Esther, the Thornhill's cook of nearly 3 decades, had herself been found dead in the kitchen, an empty cup beside her containing traces of the same toxic substance. What the officials did not yet know, but would soon discover, was the absence of 2 slaves from the household: Ida, a young house slave, and Samuel, a stable hand. Their disappearance added another layer to the emerging narrative, one that some would interpret as evidence of a broader conspiracy, while others would see it as an opportunistic flight during the chaos. By midday, the official investigation had established a timeline of events. Medical examination of the victims suggested a powerful plant-based toxin, though its exact nature remained unclear to Charleston's physicians. The symptoms: violent gastric distress followed by respiratory difficulty and eventual heart failure, matched several known poisons. While the authorities worked to piece together what had happened inside the mansion, Ida and Samuel were miles away, moving steadily northward through the coastal marshlands. They traveled by night and hid during daylight, guided by contacts from the marsh settlement that Esther had mentioned. The gold locket she had given them purchased silence and assistance from those they encountered. A ferryman who asked no questions, a farmer's widow who offered her barn as shelter for a day. During these hours of hiding and waiting, Samuel told Ida the full story of what had happened at the Christmas ball. He had heard it from one of the house slaves, who had fled the mansion in terror and taken refuge in the stables. The story of Esther's final act of vengeance left Ida silent for a long while. She knew she wouldn't escape. Ida finally said, understanding dawning, "That's why she made sure we got away first." Samuel nodded. She traded her life for our chance at freedom. Back in Charleston, the story of the Thornhill Christmas tragedy spread through the city like wildfire, growing more sensational with each telling. Some versions painted Esther as a deranged servant who had snapped under the pressure of holiday preparations. Others whispered more quietly in certain quarters, suggesting a calculated act of vengeance from a woman who had suffered unimaginable losses. The house slaves who had served at the ball were interrogated harshly, though none could or would provide information about Esther's motives or methods. Most genuinely knew nothing. Esther had kept her plan entirely to herself, protecting them from complicity. A few might have suspected something, but chose loyalty to their fellow slave over truth to their oppressors. 3 days after Christmas, a special edition of the Charleston Mercury carried the headline, "Christmas Poisoning. Prominent Citizens Murdered by Vengeful Slave." The article detailed William Thornhill's history as a fair and generous master, while describing Esther as sullen and secretive by nature, harboring unknown grievances. No mention was made of her children sold away, of Jeremiah's death, or of Lucy's recent sale. Such details were irrelevant to the narrative being constructed, one that would serve as a cautionary tale to slave owners throughout the South about the dangers lurking in their kitchens and quarters. As a result of the incident, new laws were proposed in the South Carolina legislature, further restricting the already limited movements and privileges of enslaved cooks and house servants. Slave patrols increased throughout the state, and harsh examples were made of any slaves showing the slightest sign of insubordination. Yet whispers of a different story circulated through slave quarters across the Low Country. In these tellings, Esther was no murderous villain, but a deliverer of long overdue justice. Her name was spoken with a mixture of awe and reverence. Her act seen not as a crime, but as a strike against an inhuman system. These stories traveled along the invisible networks that connected enslaved communities, carried by house servants who accompanied their masters on visits, by market women who exchanged news along with goods, by field hands temporarily hired out to neighboring plantations. 1 week after Christmas, Ida and Samuel reached a safe house in North Carolina, a small farm owned by a Quaker family known for their abolitionist sympathies. Here, they rested for several days while arrangements were made for the next leg of their journey. The farm's attic had a hidden compartment where runaways could be concealed if slave catchers came calling, a common feature of stations on the Underground Railroad. During these days of waiting, Ida found herself remembering Esther's kitchen lessons. Not just cooking techniques, but the subtle wisdom the older woman had imparted over years of shared work. Never let them see what you're really thinking, Esther had often said. Keep your true self hidden away, safe from their reach. Ida understood now that Esther had been preparing her all along, not just to cook, but to survive. The journey north continued in stages, a wagon ride concealed beneath sacks of grain, a night crossing of a river, days of walking through winter woods guided by the North Star. With each mile, the fear of pursuit gradually diminished, though it never entirely disappeared. The deeper they moved into free states, the more they encountered others like themselves. Men and women who had fled bondage in search of the liberty that was their birthright. By late February 1848, Ida and Samuel reached Philadelphia, where they connected with members of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. These abolitionists helped them establish new identities and find work. Ida as a domestic servant for a sympathetic Quaker family, Samuel as a stable hand at a busy downtown livery. They lived separately but met when possible, bound by their shared journey and the memory of those left behind. On one such meeting in early spring, walking through a Philadelphia park, where the first crocuses pushed through the thawing earth, Ida revealed something she had kept secret since their escape. I knew what would happen to her, Ida said quietly. The night before the ball, Esther told me she'd find her freedom too, but in a different way. I didn't understand then what she meant. Samuel was silent for a moment, then said, she chose her own way out after making them pay for what they'd done. Ida nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Do you think she found peace in the end? Samuel looked up at the vast sky arching above Philadelphia. The same sky that stretched over Charleston, over the unmarked grave where Esther now lay. I believe she did, he said finally. She settled accounts that had been open far too long. As spring bloomed into summer, news from the South became increasingly distant, like scenes from another life. Occasionally, travelers or newspapers brought word of Charleston, of investigations concluded, of the Thornhill property sold to cover debts, of Mistress Caroline returning to her family in Virginia, a widow seemingly broken by tragedy. For Ida and Samuel, these were echoes from a past that grew fainter with each passing day. They were building new lives now, lives where they owned themselves, where their labor benefited no master, where they could speak their minds without fear. It wasn't perfect freedom. Not in a country still half enslaved, where even in free states, black people faced discrimination and the constant threat of kidnapping by slave catchers. But it was a beginning. On Christmas Eve of 1848, 1 year after their flight from the Thornhill mansion, Ida and Samuel met at a small church in Philadelphia's black community. After the service, They walked through streets dusted with fresh snow, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I've been thinking about Esther today," Ida said as they paused on a bridge overlooking the Schuylkill River. "About her courage." Samuel nodded. "She gave us our chance. I won't waste it, nor I," Ida agreed. From her pocket, she withdrew a small object that caught the moonlight. Esther's gold locket, which they had saved despite opportunities to sell it for much-needed money. Inside was a tiny scrap of fabric from one of Esther's headscarves, placed there by Ida as a remembrance. Together they stood in silence, holding the small token between them, a tangible link to the woman whose final act of defiance had purchased their freedom. Below them, the river flowed dark and steady, carrying the past away, even as it nourished the present and future. Like that river, they would continue forward, carrying Esther's memory with them, honoring her sacrifice through lives lived in hard-won liberty. In Charleston, the Thornhill Christmas tragedy gradually faded from public memory, becoming merely another footnote in the city's long history. Few remembered the names of those who died. Fewer still remembered Esther, except as an example of the dangers of allowing slaves too much responsibility. Her grave in the slave cemetery remained unmarked, eventually disappearing beneath encroaching weeds and time's passage. But in the stories, told in hidden corners of slave quarters throughout the South, in the oral histories passed down through generations of black families, in the private memories of those who had known her or heard of her deed, Esther lived on, not as a criminal, but as a woman who had seized control of her destiny in the only way available to her, delivering a justice that the law of her time denied. And far to the north, too, young people who owed her their freedom spoke her name with reverence, ensuring that her story, her courage, and her sacrifice would not be forgotten. This was the story of Esther Johnson. She died by her own hand on December 25, 1847, after poisoning her master and several prominent Charleston citizens. Her body was buried in the slave cemetery of the Thornhill plantation with no marker or ceremony. No official record of her life or death exists beyond court documents relating to the poisoning investigation, which describe her only as Thornhill's cook, a Negro woman of approximately 40 years. The echoes of Esther's final Christmas feast resonate through time, a stark reminder of the brutal fight for dignity in the face of oppression. If these untold stories of defiance and survival stir your soul, join our community. Subscribe to Your channel name to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of American slavery. Your support helps us keep these powerful narratives alive.